is Digital Marketing Depot, broadcasting live. I'm Karen Burka, your webinar producer. Thank you for joining us today for Google, the EU, and Comparative Shopping Services, Minefields and Opportunity Everywhere. We are very pleased to welcome Andreas Reiffen, the CEO of Crealytics, as our presenter today. Now, before I turn the webinar over to Andreas, I want to tell all of you a couple of things. If you need some help or have a question for our speaker, just use the Q&A box, and we will do our best to help you. If you want to tell a friend, check out our sponsor, Crealytics, or Digital Marketing Depot. There are some widgets at the bottom of your screen. Just click on them, and they will take you where you want to go. Remember, you can customize your audience console to move or resize any windows that you have open. Now, we are going to hear a lot of great content today. So I wanted to let you know we are recording this broadcast, and we will make it available for viewing on demand this afternoon. I'll send an email out when it's ready. So with that business taken care of, let me make a more formal introduction. Andreas Reiffen is an entrepreneur, marketing technologist, and a recognized expert in data-driven advertising. He's also a regular contributor to Search Engine Land. Now you can see a more complete bio and contact information for Andreas on the left side of your audience console. Remember, everyone, if you have questions for our industry expert, please make good use of that Q&A box. I'll get to as many of those questions live after the formal presentation. So before I turn the webinar over to Andreas, we've got a poll question for you, audience. We want to learn a little bit more about your experience with comparison shopping services so Andreas can kind of tailor his content to your specific needs. So the question is, how long have you been working with a comparison shopping service, which we'll use as the acronym CSS throughout the presentation? Are you pretty new? The EU ruling got you going? Have you been there, done that? You've been on it for a while now. You're pretty experienced. Or are you viewing from the sideline, maybe waiting to see the impact before joining? And in that case, I'm sure Andreas will have a lot of good information for you today. So think about that. Please choose one. And then I'm going to pull up the results, and then Andreas will join us to take a look at the results and start his presentation. So Andreas, here we've got a group of people, almost over 75%, who are still viewing from the sideline, kind of waiting to see the impact. So I'm sure that the information you're going to provide today will be very helpful for everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a very interesting result indeed, and I'm pretty happy to see that most people are still viewing this from the sideline. The reason is that I've seen lots of companies rushing into it because there are now these monetary incentives in place, and it hasn't worked out well for everyone from scratch because the whole thing is a little bit more complicated. So I guess for all these folks which are viewing from the sideline, we will have a quite informative session, and I hope I can give you some guidance on how to get this right.
Great. Well, here's your first slide.
Thanks a lot. So let's take a brief look at the objectives of this webinar, what we want to achieve. It's going to probably take us somewhat around 30 to 45 minutes. We probably won't need the entire hour. So what I'd like to do is first recap and give you some background on the current CSS opportunity. So what happened, what's going on, why are we seeing these changes? Then take a brief look at the opportunities we have, but also, and this is a point which was overseen, which has been overseen in the market, understand the risks of all this. Then we will take a look at the auction dynamics to explain how the CSS campaigns work alongside the regular business as usual campaigns. And we then take a specific deep dive into a data scarcity problem, which happens when you divide your data between your regular campaigns and one or even multiple CSS providers. And last but not least, we'd like to take a brief look at some artifact of what's going on, which allows us now to better target the SERPs and the shopping tab, which could be a big benefit beyond these monetary incentives which are driving the whole thing right now. Let's get into it. So a while ago, there was this fine Google received by the European Commission, and the ruling was that Google was abusing of its market power and favoring its own shopping services instead of being unbiased and showing also results from comparison shopping providers. So as a response, Google made it technically possible for CSS companies to also show ads on the SERPs, but we realized that in the end, this was just a theoretical opportunity and nothing really happened in the market. The reason is that most retailers were just not interested in having another intermediary, someone who's managing part of their PLA budget and interfering with their regular activities. So nothing happened, and at some point of time, I guess the pressure from the EU increased, and Google was afraid of the EU shutting down the whole shopping service. And as a response, Google then implemented monetary incentives to force the market to change, or to provide big incentives so that budgets shift towards CSS companies until they probably get a certain share of the market and Google is safe in front of the EU. So this is the background on all this. Maybe a brief qualitative comment from my side. I think when Google was forced to allow comparison shopping providers in the SERPs, it actually is something where I don't see that it provides big value. If you take a look at what's going on, is that comparison shopping providers have the same feed. Google is matching queries to product ads, and the value provided by the comparison shopping services is very thin. You don't even need a website because the traffic is going directly to the retailer. And Google argued in this dispute that there is no, that the comparison shopping providers wouldn't have any stakes in this game because their service is just too thin. And so I'm not 100% in line, or don't believe that the decision was actually right. And what we are seeing today is that Google, in fact, was right, because every agency is now becoming a comparison shopping service, just because all you need is a working student hacking a website together and putting some products up. So, but anyway, this is my personal opinion, but I think it's interesting to get a perspective on this. So let's take a brief look at what's specifically going on and what this looks like. Previously, and also if you're currently in the US, you will only see product ads by Google, and as they're all coming from Google, it doesn't even say by Google in this clickable link you see on the screen on the left-hand side of the slide. Today in Europe, you see that ads are called by Google or by whatever comparison shopping service. So we know that the vast majority of the clicks, probably around about 99%, will always go directly to the retailer and not even hit the comparison shopping site. If people click this clickable link at the bottom, then the traffic will go to the comparison shopping site, which is just 1% and doesn't really move the needle. It's important to understand that CSS providers can target mainly the SERPs, but initially they were not allowed to show up on the shopping tab. As things get highly complex this way, Google now made it possible for CSS companies to run everything, like the regular business as usual campaigns, which target the shopping tab, as well as the SERPs. However, there won't be monetary incentives for ads being shown on the shopping tab. Let's go right into the opportunities and the risks. So on the left side, you see what opportunities we have today based on the incentives Google put in place. This is what everyone has been focusing on, and this is also why I'm I'm surprised in a good way to see the result that most companies seem to still be watching this from the sideline. So one incentive is that CSS providers are favored in the auctions. So if you run your ads directly through Google, a certain percentage of your bid price is being deducted from the bid. So you enter the auctions with a lower effective bid. We don't know what this exact percentage is, and this is something we need to figure out. Nobody has given us specific information on this, but we will learn later on how important it is to know whether it's 20%, 10, or maybe just 5%. So this is one big advantage. The other one Google put in place is a kickback called spend match. So if you spend enough money, you can get up to 32K on a 30 days period in terms of kickback, which is quite some money, and the reason why we're seeing this gold rush, and also a reason why many companies haven't taken a look at potential downsides, because it looks all so compelling. So let's take a look at why this could also be dangerous and what the downsides are, and why eventually a loss in performance might overcompensate what you could make in terms of kickback and other monetary incentives. So first of all, the data will be divided. So you have to understand that this is now not a new channel. It's exactly the same thing which you have covered today with your regular campaigns, and part of this will now go to a CSS provider, or many or several CSS providers, and the other part will stay with you in your business as usual campaigns. So it means that from 100% of the data you saw previously, a certain percentage is cut off and you don't see it anymore if the CSS accounts are managed by someone else. Even if you manage them by yourself directly, you have to really make sure that you find ways to re-aggregate all the data. But we will talk about this in more detail. Then you start competing between CSS and your business as usual campaigns. So the higher bid will enter the auctions in the end, and will also define the second price bid. It's important to mention that if you have 5 CSS providers and yourself bidding all in a row, so the highest bid is coming from you, the second highest bid is coming from one of your CSS providers, and so on, then you won't second price yourself through your own bids. However, it's very unrealistic in such a crowded market that you line up in a row, and it's way more likely that you will have dozens of advertisers in between. And in this case, the highest bid will also define what you end up paying in the second price auction. So how does a bidding usually work? So we always see this relationship of decreasing marginal revenue. So you keep increasing your bids, and at some point the revenue starts flattening out. There's another view. Sometimes we see an S-curve in Google Shopping, so traffic starts picking up at a certain point when you raise your bids over a certain threshold, but usually you're in the range of decreasing marginal revenues. And you find a balance between volume and the cost you are paying. And this way you find your optimal slot on this curve. In this example here, you're bidding €1 and the actual, you have a earning per click of €1 and the actual bid is 0.8, and with 0.8, let's assume you maximize your performance. So let's take a look at how the auction dynamics now work. So what you see on the right side, the sum, this is what you would have seen before managing all through your regular accounts. So 100 clicks, 10 sales, €500 in revenue, a €5 revenue per click, and you work on a certain ROAS target, let's say 5. So you end up bidding €1 in this specific case. But now things have changed, and you run your business as usual campaigns, but then you also run 3 different CSS providers simultaneously. And of course, as the traffic volume overall will never increase because there's just so much inventory available, now the data is being split. So the left column, Crealytics business as usual, would eventually only get 30 clicks and a certain amount of sales. Then we also run our own CSS platform, which gets another bunch of clicks. And then we have 2 other CSS providers also playing the game. And we know that in Google Shopping, data scarcity is one of the biggest issues because you already have so many products where there's just not enough information available to calculate your bids. If you now further break that down, you could see a situation where CSS3 in this example is just getting 20 clicks, and by coincidence, they make 3 sales. So things look incredibly good, and if someone seeing this fraction of data is making a decision, it's very likely that they will push an aggressive bid. Let's assume the bid was 2. Then you have another CSS provider getting 30 clicks and making just 1 sale. So the earning per click is very low, just 0.2. So you see the bids live in a range between 0.2 euros and €2. So in this case, the winner would be CSS3 with a $2 bid. And the $2 bid would then also define the second price. So it's very likely that some competitor is bidding €1.80 or something, and then this defines the price, the cost per click you would pay. If we take a look at the next slide, what could then happen is that you move further up to the right side of the revenue curve, and in the end, your CPC might double in this example. Your cost goes up by 115% because you get also more traffic, but you only get 15% more revenue. So this is a situation which you need to avoid, because otherwise the impact of the CSS opportunity in terms of, or the decrease in performance will overcompensate what you might make in through the monetary incentives. So let's explain this in some further detail here. How does the whole thing work? So let's assume there are searches happening on the SERP, but also there are searches happening in the shopping tab. In this case, ASOS shirts, people might type this in the search bar on the regular search result page, but also people might click on the shopping tab and enter the same search. So the CSS shopping campaign will only target the SERP, whereas the business as usual shopping campaign is eligible for the SERP and the shopping tab. So the question now is, how does Google make the decision who will win the auction on the SERP? And what they will do is compare the effective bid. So after the deduction of the regular campaigns, which is somewhere between 0 and 20%, and the CSS bid. And in this example here, the effective CSS bid is $1. The business as usual bid is $0.9 or euros, whatever currency you want to take, and the CSS bid would win the auction on the SERP. So explaining this 0 to 20% comparative cost advantage. So in the business as usual campaigns where you don't run it through a CSS, there is a deduction of up to 20%, which means that the CSS bid, if you bid on the same product and you bid $1, the CSS bid will be effectively 25% higher. Again, we do not know the exact number. This is a maximum, the 25%. It could potentially only be 5 to 10%. So this means, depending on what the exact percentage is, there's a maximum bid differential allowed so that your CSS campaigns will outbid the business as usual campaign in the SERPs, which is something you want because you get this comparative cost advantage, but you also get kickbacks if you spend. So it's much smarter to leave the SERPs ideally at the greatest extent possible to the CSS, while the business as usual mainly start targeting the shopping tab. So there are two potential situations. The left one is that the CSS shopping, as I mentioned, would mainly target the SERPs, and the business as usual would always be outbid and doesn't target the SERPs anymore. Or on the right-hand side is the situation where you run into competition, and oftentimes the business as usual will win over the CSS. So the ideal scenario is clearly the one on the left hand side, where you leverage all financial incentives, comparative advantage in the auctions, plus the monetary incentives granted by Google. So our recommendation here is that over time, you try to shift traffic on the SERP to the CSS. Initially, you will have quality scores on your business as usual campaigns. You have performance history. You know how you could bid. It's very likely that once you start, that your CSS share will be relatively low on the SERPs. So try to max out the opportunity and shift traffic on the SERP constantly to the CSS. We do not know exactly what the traffic share between shopping tab on the one hand side and the SERP on the other side would be. We assume that it's roughly in the range of 90%. So it means if you compare your CSS performance against your business as usual performance, that CSS should at some point generate more overall traffic in total. So I mentioned initially that there's a big issue regarding data scarcity. So to explain it again, before you got all the traffic yourself and you could see everything. Now you are managing things in separate buckets. The easiest case is that you run your regular campaigns, business as usual, and one CSS. In this case, data divides. So in order to have the same situation as you had before, it now makes sense to aggregate data across your CSS and your business as usual. If you run 5 CSS providers, you would need to aggregate the data across the 5 different ones. So how this works is until the point where you have enough information available, you use an average revenue per click across CSS and business as usual. So at some point, you will see differences. You will see that the business as usual is eventually performing better, has a higher ROAS than the CSS, and you could then start reflecting this. However, and this picks up my previous point, you must make sure that the bid differential is not too high. So if you bid too high on the business as usual campaigns, these business as usual campaigns will take traffic on the SERP away from the CSS, meaning that you don't benefit from the cost advantage and you don't get monetary incentives. So this is the way we can approach this. So there's one really exciting new opportunity right now, which is actually something the market has asked for quite a while, but Google didn't want to implement it. So if you target the SERPs, you are just targeting regular users, not necessarily all the ones who are now in the shopping mode. People who click into the shopping tab, they are already pre-qualified. So what we see is that the conversion rate and revenue per clicks on the shopping tab are substantially higher than they are on the SERPs. So what we as advertisers would want to do is leave some of the not so good traffic on the SERPs to your competitors, meaning bid low, and raise your bids on the shopping tab where you see great performance and take away the best traffic from your competitors. So far, we had to work on an average bid because there was no way to specifically target the shopping tab and the SERPs. Now, with the CSS opportunity, there seems to be a workaround because as the business as usual campaigns get some comparative cost disadvantage in the auctions, you can bid slightly higher on the business as usual accounts, and the CSS will still take over the traffic on the SERPs. So in the end, what we want to do is optimize our campaigns for two different efficiency curves. The one on the left-hand side is not as steep as the other one, which is based on the different conversion rates and different performance we see. So this way, what you can do is try to really push your bids on the shopping tab and get a better performance out of this. You just need to figure out what the point is. If you take the same product in the business as usual campaigns and the same product in the CSS campaigns, you have to make sure that your business as usual campaign does not overbid your CSS campaigns on the SERPs. Then you actually leverage this new opportunity. So we started probably roughly 2.5 months ago working on this. Initially, we started running campaigns without any specific methodology, and we realized that we saw very mixed results. So it wasn't as easy as we thought, and we were also in a kind of gold rush. Now, over time, I think we figured out a pretty smart way on how to do this. So what we as Crealytics provide is a platform which is, we are official Google CSS partner now, and we've figured out the data aggregation piece and how to align the bids. The product needs to be tweaked in the sense that we don't know what the exact bid differential we can allow would be, but it's something we are currently working on. So it's really helpful because we have a fully integrated CSS reporting, so you can always see your CSS performance alongside your business as usual performance. You have the data aggregation, so you won't suffer from data scarcity, and it's a fully integrated bidding which aligns bids between CSS and business as usual. So I think quite helpful to manage this, but I hope that my advice also helps the ones who just want to rely on their own methodology, want to do this manually. It's probably possible, getting very close to what we suggest, even without using our product. So actually, it took me 28 minutes now to run through everything, so we have plenty of time for additional questions. I know that Karen has an additional poll question, which we could have right now, and then we have a lot of time for the Q&A, and I hope that you have good questions, and I can help you and answer all of them. Thanks a lot.
Great. Yes, thank you, Andy, and that was a lot of great information. We have gotten a few audience questions in, so to our attendees, please keep them coming. As Andreas has just said, he's very graciously going to stay on so he can answer questions to your specific needs. But before we get to that, we did have one more question. Now, we understand that a lot of you have not yet started using CSSs, but for those of you who answered yes, whether you have a little bit or a lot of experience, we wanted to know a little bit more about how your results are doing. So our question is, if you're already a CSS user, how has this new opportunity affected your campaign? So our answers, and we had a little bit of fun with this, is everything is groovy. We're seeing better performance at a lower cost per click, or maybe things are the same as it ever was. There's no difference really in your pre versus post announcement results, or maybe it is getting crowded out there and your performance is starting to suffer a little bit based on the changes that have happened And some of the things that Andreas has just told us is really going to help you. But think about that. Think about if you have questions for him. I also want to remind everyone that we are recording this broadcast, as I mentioned earlier, and it will be available on demand in case you want to go back through some of Andreas's comments and slides at another time when you have a little bit more time. So let's take a look at the results, Andy, and see what people are finding in terms of results. So we've got about 25% saying everything is great. They're getting better performance. Only a little bit more than 10% saying that things are the same, but unfortunately, performance is suffering for nearly 2/3 of our attendees. So what do you think about those results? Is that surprising or kind of what you expect?
Actually, I'm not surprised at all. It's the exact reason why we're having this webinar, and it's pretty much what we saw initially when we didn't apply advanced strategies. It looks all so good, but the thing is complicated. And if you do it the easy way, you take some, you get some incentives, but you harm your performance. And the key reasons, in my opinion, are that you, in the end, have the scarcity problem, and the bidding will lead to inflated CPCs. There might be quality score issues initially involved. So the very, very good thing is that most people attending this webinar are still waiting and trying to find a smart way on how to tackle this instead of rushing into it. So we've seen very mixed results initially, but have figured out a way to make it work.
Great. So good. So let's get some to our audience questions because they are starting to come in now. And I'm going to put the first one up. Andy, like we discussed previously, I'm going to put it up here and then I'm going to read it to give you a couple of seconds to think about your response. Here's our first question. Could we use the shopping priority setting to have CSS as a high priority and BAU as a medium priority to catch the traffic not caught by the CSS campaign?
Actually, very good question. I haven't tried this and don't know whether this actually works. But it's pretty smart because then we could eventually segment this out in an easier way. I will take a note and check whether this is possible. So the one who asked the question can drop me an email and I will get back to him. It could be a good idea, but actually I don't know whether it works. Need to test it.
Okay. Let's get to our next question then. How do you align the bids between the BAU and CSS?
So the way we envision to do this initially is setting the very same bids for the business as usual and the CSS. Then it's pretty easy. You just aggregate data on the same product. So you take a certain GTIN, you take the performance on the CSS campaign and the performance of the same product on the business as usual. You then calculate a bid for both the CSS and the business as usual. As there are now opportunities to bid higher on the shopping tab and leverage this opportunity in a better way, we actually want to allow some bid differential. So what I mentioned this initially, what we need to find out is what the actual comparative advantage in the auctions is. So how much is being deducted from your business as usual bid? And this is something you just have to play around a little bit and see at what point of time the business as usual campaign starts to outbid the CSS campaign on the SERP. And then you simply calculate bids for both CSS and business as usual, but you make sure that you don't allow a too high differential. So the business as usual bid shouldn't be too much higher than the CSS bid. And this is the way you need to do it. I can't tell you what the exact percentage is so far.
Okay, great. We've got lots of questions coming in now, Andy. You've gotten people really thinking about how to use these bid strategies. one's a little longer.
Karen, before you go in, I think it's exactly this question coming in, which I read before. So the question here is, what happens if you run your business as usual campaign via CSS and nothing else? So if I understand it right, the question is whether, as Google is now allowing CSS providers to target the SERP and the shopping tab, how would we do this? So first of all, it's a way to solve the scarcity problem, because then you get all the data at once and you don't struggle with the bidding. So it's definitely something you could do. The other one potential downside is that in this case, you won't leverage the new targeting opportunity. So I'm really excited about us now being able to bid higher where the conversion rate and the earning per click is higher, so on the shopping tab. So depending on your on the skills and capabilities of your team, if you feel confident that you can do the data aggregation piece, in this case, you might be able to differentiate your bid, and I think you are better off segmenting it out, because it's not just, it doesn't only have a downside of data scarcity, it has the big targeting potential. If you don't feel confident about this, I would definitely recommend aggregating it and using the CSS to target both. What we, by the way, do not recommend at all is having multiple different CSS providers in there. So if you run your business as usual campaigns and you run the CSS campaigns to some external party which doesn't give you full access to the data, then you will never be able to solve the scarcity problem. And even worse if you have 5 different parties who don't know what they are doing. So it must be aligned. The easiest way is to let CSS run business as usual plus SERP and shopping tab both. And the other way would be to see all the data and bid higher on the shopping tab, or the effective bid on the shopping tab would be higher.
Okay, let's keep going. All right, here's a little skeptical question. The theory is great, but what happens when Google removes the temporary incentives to use CSS?
I love the question. There's someone really smart who has asked it. So, of course, it won't be around forever. What happened is Google felt the pressure of the EU, so they had to force some change in the market, and they did it through all the incentives. At a point of time when the market share of the CSS companies is big enough, of course, Google will take away the incentives, or at least part of the incentives. We do not know when this will be, and we also don't know when they will take back everything or something will be left. My personal gut feeling tells me that probably at some point when the market share is big enough, they will just give incentives which are just enough so that everything doesn't switch back to where it was. So Google needs to keep this ratio between CSS traffic and the regular retailer traffic stable at some point. And so you can guess yourself at what point it will stay stable. But if everything is taken fully away, I'm afraid that in a relatively short amount of time, we are back to normal. Except this new targeting possibility, there is no benefit for nobody. We see a very similar situation, the same players in the market, the same traffic available, but a high degree of complexity.
Okay. Now it looks like we've got a note here, Andy, for you. If you can check your WhatsApp, we have an answer to that first question regarding the attendee who asked about whether you can prioritize your campaign. You want to take a second to take a look at that, Andreas?
So yeah, the answer is the campaign priority won't work as the campaigns need to run in separate accounts due to being in separate feeds. So it's this is what I suspected. So it's you have completely separate feeds. So the way Google is handling things, you would need to run it in a single account, which you can't, and then the priorities won't hold. Which is a pity because the general idea is really smart, but doesn't work.
Okay. Let's keep going. We've got a few more here. Would you start with a single CSS provider and then add more over time, or do you recommend to start with more than one provider?
I recommend to run everything through a single party. So you have to make a decision whether you want to give it all to your CSS provider, which then should be a specialist in Google Shopping with a lot of experience so that you trust them to do this. If you find one, that's one possibility, or you run it all by yourself. Means you license some comparison shopping platform which is accepted by Google, and you run your business as usual campaigns. But the thing is, you need to see all the data. If you run it through multiple providers at the same time and you are not fully aligned, so you need to see the data and you need to be in control of all the different bits. If you manage to get 5 different CSS providers and your spend is big enough so that you can get 5 times the kickback, and you then run it all by yourself for all 5 instances, you see the data and you can bid. Then in theory, this is something you could do. It's very unrealistic that you that you manage to do it this way. The regular way would be if you run this through an agency today. Your agency has a comparison shopping service. In this case, they run your business as usual campaign and the CSS campaign. They do the data aggregation and they align the bids. Alternatively, you can hand it all to a CSS provider. Having multiple CSS providers and splitting your traffic, not getting anything more, but just inflating your bids, I would highly recommend to not do this.
All right. We're going to keep going. Questions keep coming in. How do you know how much revenue is incremental? We are seeing a lot of traffic via brand search terms are coming through the CSS.
So you have to take into account the overall performance of CSS plus business as usual. There is not more inventory available. So the thing is, do you get the same revenue as you got before at a lower cost? Then you are better off. Or are you running things at the same cost while taking, of course, all the financial incentives into account, and you get more revenue, then you're also better off. But one general misconception is this is not a new channel. It's taking the same amount of traffic, the same inventory, the same real estate on Google, and now splitting it. So there is not a single click more available than it was before. It's just that you have to make sure that you benefit taking all these incentives into account and a potential performance decrease that you still benefit. So do the math, take it in the whole bucket, include CSS plus business as usual, aggregate all the revenues, aggregate all the costs, deduct the financial incentives, the kickback from the costs, and then evaluate whether you're better off than before or not.
Great. Here comes another one, Andy. In addition to the rebate, is the CPC discounted as well? Or does the historical quality score put this? The second part of that is a little jumbled, but do you get the drift here?
I think so, and I guess the right slide is number 14. You should see it now. So yes, there is this CPC deduction. So the regular campaigns get some comparative disadvantage in the auctions. In this example, we assumed 20% from your business as usual bid, max CPC, is being deducted. So the effective bid would be 0.8 in this case. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important. We do not know whether this 20% is accurate or whether it's lower. Nobody has told us what the exact value is, but we know that there is some CPC deducted from the Google bid directly. I actually don't know exactly what was meant with this with the quality score part of the question.
Okay, yeah, it seemed to be a little bit incomplete there, so we'll hope that that was enough of an answer for our attendee there. All right, let's maybe get to one or two more, and then we will start to wrap it up, okay? All right, you're talking about the SERP and Shopping tab as things you can place separate bids on. Putting CSS on the SERP and BAU on the Shopping tab, but that's not possible, right? So maybe explain a little bit about how that works for our attendees.
Yeah, let's do this. Yes and no. So there's a workaround to make this possible. So let's take a look here. So what you usually have is the situation in the left column, CSS Shopping campaign is targeting the SERP only, and the business as usual shopping campaign is targeting the SERP and the Shopping tab. So in this case, it's the CSS and BAU will always interfere with each other. What you can do, and this is now the workaround, you can make sure that the effective CSS bid is always a little bit higher than the effective business as usual bid. We are always talking about products with the same GTIN. So you need to figure out, you need to match a product with GTIN 55.8 with in the CSS with product 55.8 in the business as usual campaign, and make sure that the effective CSS bid, taking into account that from the BAU bid, something will be deducted. If the CSS bid is higher after the deduction, Google will always show the CSS bid. Of course, taking into account all device audience modifiers and so on. But there is a way to make sure that CSS overbids the BAU in the SERPs. And thanks to the comparative cost disadvantage of the BAU campaigns, it's possible to run higher bids in the BAU to get more traffic on the Shopping tab and run an effectively higher bid on the Shopping tab than the CSS bid is on the SERP.
Okay, great. We're going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to start to wrap it up. How can you stop data feed partners' bids on CSS? We recognize that some of our data feed partners running on CSS without knowing about it. Is there any way to block them?
Actually, I haven't heard of this. As far as I know, you need to agree that a CSS provider can show ads on your behalf. So maybe forwarding the question to someone on my team on the other end, I might get a response quickly. I haven't heard of this yet. So far, there's always there must also be a commercial agreement in place, because otherwise you have someone spending money for you, but you don't pay for it. So I haven't heard of such a case. But in the end, the retailer is in a position where he can shut that down.
Okay, well, if we get more information about that, we'll make sure that your team follows up with that attendee. So here's our last question for today, because we are starting to run out of time. How does Google ensure that an advertiser isn't bidding against themselves? Does the advertiser need to do anything specific to ensure that doesn't happen?
So very good question, and important to understand the nuances. So first of all, in theory, you do not bid against yourself. If your business as usual bid is €1, if your CSS one partner is bidding €0.9 and CSS 2 partner is bidding €0.8, and then the next lower bidder is bidding €0.5, your business as usual with €1 bid would win the auction, and the next external provider would define the second price. So your business as usual campaign bidding €1 would effectively pay a cost per click of €0.5. This is a constructed example because it's totally unrealistic situation that yourself and all your comparison shopping partners would line up in a row without having anyone else in between. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies trying to enter the auctions. And the regular case is that in between yourself and your CSS providers, there's always some other retailer or some CSS advertising on behalf of another retailer. In this case, you, of course, your highest bid, if your bids are not aligned, then you pay a lot of money in the end. And that's, although you see examples, I think even one shown by Google, which says you do not second price yourself, this is not the problem. The problem is other bidders in between, which then raise the bid. So if you run it with 5 CSS providers and one bids $10, that's in the end defines how much you pay. It won't be 10, but the next bidder might be at 7 or something. So you end up 7, although all your other bids are below 1.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, everyone, that is all the time we have today. I want to thank Andreas for a very informative and timely presentation, and I want to thank our audience for all of your great questions. We had a couple more there, and the folks at Crealytics have let me know that they are happy to follow up with those questions that did not get answered today. So don't worry, everyone's going to get an answer to their questions. I do want to offer a special thank you to our sponsor, Crealytics, and you can visit them, as you see here, at www.crealytics.com. That's all for our broadcast today. We look forward to seeing you next time, right here at Digital Marketing.